again everybody, welcome to CMN103, Introduction to Creative Industries. Today I have Associate Professor Sandy O'Sullivan join us. So welcome Sandy.
Well, thank you very much, it's lovely to be here.
And Sandy's going to be talking about creativity. And in the first lecture, I don't know if you can remember this, but we talked about key concepts, and I was talking about the difference between a concept and an idea. And one of those key concepts that we're going to be exploring in CMN103 is the concept of creativity. So obviously I was suggesting that concepts are broader than ideas, and concepts envelop, if you like, or they're an umbrella concept or term that inhabits a number of different ideas. So I thought you might offer an understanding of what the ideas are within creativity, what perhaps if you've got a working definition of creativity, what you see creativity as being.
I'm not sure that I have a single working definition, and I think that's important not to have one. Part of the reason that I think we have to keep it flexible in terms of how we talk about it is that, often when we're talking about creativity broadly, we're talking about the idea of ideas. But in fact, we have to have something that brings them together. And we always do. We have something that works as a carriage of it. If it's a project that we're working on that has some kind of definition around it, maybe we're doing an exhibition, maybe we're running a campaign of some kind, and that's the overarching work that's there, and that has to have a vision attached to it, but it also has to have ideas that sit inside it. And I think it's a really important tool to be able to recognise the difference between those, but also to understand the relationship between people bringing in ideas and what it means for them in talking to one another about those ideas and deciding to shelve something, to go in another direction, or to move it forward in a particular way. And I've done a lot of work across the museum space. And across the museum space, there's a really interesting opportunity where you can engage with the idea of audience, because you have visitors who come into a museum and they have a whole lot of ideas that they come in with, but you can challenge them. So you need to know what it is that you're actually trying to say, know what it is that an audience might already think about that, and then you're going to use ideas to be able to form that relationship between those two, to be able to get them to think about whatever that work is in the way that you need them to. So, yeah.
So to me it makes sense. I'm just thinking broadly now. So it's a way, you mentioned something in that discussion then about the fact that sometimes you will discard certain ideas and sometimes you will move towards other ideas. What criteria do you use? What are you basing that? If you want a creative interaction, if you want a creative work, if you want to engage your audience creatively, what informs what you keep and what you lose?
I think a lot of what informs it is around the idea of the broader container. It's making sure that it works to that end, So, and of course that can change as well, but it needs to be negotiated in a different way. One of the things that is really tricky for people is having a fantastic idea and then discarding it because it doesn't work for the broader project. Okay. And, people get very attached to their ideas, and I think as I've developed and as I've seen other people develop as creative practitioners, as people who have charge of that, that's the work that they do, is to go, I can put that aside, might come back to it at some stage, or I can take something from that and decide that part of that works. Not hanging on to something is actually a part of the creative process, of being able to let it go and being able to run with things when they are going to work and take risks. And it is about risk taking. One of the things that I think is important is that we spend a lot of time thinking about how we meet the brief that we make, but we have to actually have some carriage of that brief as well, and we need to be able to have some level of direction with it. It's the only way that it can work. So for instance, going back to the idea of the museum exhibition, you can't have absolutely zero flexibility about how that can be constructed. You need to have a range of flexibility across it. You need to be able to be open to changing the brief somewhat. And when you can't do that, that's when you actually find that the ideas will get stuck in it, because they'll become the only thing that can work to meet that broader brief, where in fact you need to keep both as really flexible. And I think museums are always, they're a thing that a lot of people understand. People will go and experience a museum and they kind of know. They walk into an exhibition and they understand what they're seeing and, and how they're seeing it and why they're there, or they won't, and so what are you trying to do for that audience? How are you trying to bring them along with you? And sometimes it's about not bringing everyone along with you. And I think there's a lot of worry in thinking about creativity that people will go, well, this should work for everyone. But actually, a lot of creativity doesn't, nor should it. I mean, if you think about companies that are not engaged necessarily in only a creative endeavour, but a company like Apple, as an example. I mean, Apple doesn't say, we want 100% of people out there to buy Apple computers. They say, if we can get 20% of people to buy Apple products, that's fantastic. And if some of them are getting the phones and some of them are getting computers and some of them, there's cross-spread, but they're not trying to get 100%. Nobody does, and nobody can. So, so the notion of all things to all people isn't really a thing in any kind of marketing. And, people don't want creativity to be the same as marketing, like they want it to be somehow magical. And indeed it is, but, marketing obviously is one of those areas of creativity as well, and it is this space of going, what do people want, but also what am I trying to do? And it's marrying those things up, and what's, in the context of marketing, it's often also what is the company trying to do, so it's bringing all of these things together, but it's doing it with a touch of creativity. I kind of love doing that through humour. I think that's a really incredibly clever way to do it, but it also narrows an audience. It's one of those factors for defining an audience, so...
Yeah. Because everybody, not everybody thinks you're funny.
That's right.
Okay,
yeah.
And you mentioned something earlier which I just want to pick up on again, and that was the ability to let go. And so I just thought, I think it's really worth reinforcing the fact that the work is never wasted. It's never wasted because it's got you to that stage where you've identified that you need to move beyond it or you need to do something different. Or you put it to one side and 3 months later or 6 months later, you kind of pick it up, and it has another application in another context or in another form, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
and I think part of the reason that I've always felt very strongly about that is that my work has been as a musician as well, and as a musician you mess things up all the time. Like, it's actually part of the process of learning. But every craft form is like that. You go through a process of learning by messing up a little bit and then getting it right. But sometimes it's in the messing up that you find things. Sometimes it's by hitting a bum chord that you actually find a really interesting way of engaging, and something that you want to explore, but sometimes it's later. So that, and certainly I think with designing that's the case. Some of the design work that I've done, visual design work that I've done, I've thought, that doesn't work for this, but it might work later. I think you also have to understand that sometimes things just don't work ever, and that's okay. Sometimes the bum note is a bum note, and it's all right for it to be that. And it's still part of the journey of kind of understanding it and learning. So
yeah. And recognising not this, then something else.
That's right. But I also think when you work collaboratively, you have to be able to accept someone else's idea as a better idea than your own. And I think there's a lot of people who get very attached to the journey that they've had with their idea. I don't think it's like my idea's better than your idea, sometimes it is, but I think it's also about that they understand what happened along that journey. And, truthfully, I am a big fan of collaborative stuff because I think other people have better ideas than I do. I already know all my ideas, they're great, but hearing other people's is interesting and exciting. I mean, why do we watch TV? Why do we listen to the radio? Why do we do any of this stuff? Why do we have conversations with people at all? It's not just to say what we think, it's to hear what they think.
Yeah. Well, it's two things for me, and maybe I'm speaking for you as well, but certainly for myself. I find the idea through the articulation. Sometimes I have to kind of speak it or discuss it or play it, and it my meaning or the intention will emerge in that conversation and through that process as well. So the speaking, but also the listening, and I just want to kind of give a short analogy, if I may. When we talk about group work, and obviously we'll be talking about group work later on in the session, when A produces something, that's what A can contribute, and that's fantastic, but that's what A knows. But because A has contributed that, B can build on it. Now, B couldn't happen without A. And then C and D and so on. So I think that it's really important, this notion of being able to build on, and that's having this kind of yes and kind of approach to work. So rather than going no but to everybody else's idea, you go, oh yes and it's a textured embellishment, if you like.
Yeah, and also sometimes it's a swap out. You know, sometimes it is about going, actually, this doesn't, you know, what I thought my contribution was isn't as good as I thought it was. It is this, you know, so it's working that through in that way. And I think to some extent audiences have a role in that too with creativity. Whoever is experiencing and engaging with whatever the work is have a role in that. And that's why I think it's important to not just make, but to show and get response, you know, because if you don't have responses, it's actually really hard to be able to know if something really is working. And I think with creativity, across the kind of broad areas of creativity, there are some risks around that. There's some work, and the more that you're working by yourself, the greater the risk, because you're, you know, often the only person who's doing that work. And so if as a musician I play by myself, and then I think I'm doing pretty well, and then I play with other people and they go, wait, your timing is terrible, I kind of have to hear that and go, okay, well, I like my timing and I'm going to stick to it. Or, actually, you're right, my timing's the problem. And both of those are legit things, you know, but you have to make that work if you want to create something that works in that space. But it also has to work for an audience. So the audience becomes the person you're working with, and it becomes the person that you're presenting the material to. And I think we've, I think as a broad culture, you know, there's been a very large shift towards seeing audiences as part of the process of making. Social media has led some of that, but it hasn't just been that. It's been, you know, around the idea of the influence and power, but also of the desires and wants. And, you know, there's a lot of reasons why that's happened, and I think it's important to hold on to that and not hold on to older ideas about, you know, making something perfect, then, you know, if you build it, they will come. Instead, you know, if you build it and then tweak it again, then maybe more will come, or maybe actually what will happen is you'll end up with something better, you know, so. Yeah.
And do you have any, because, you know, all of this is kind of both amazing and exciting, but also quite terrifying, because you're talking about risk.
Yeah.
And you're talking about kind of vulnerability, because you're needing to kind of express yourself, expose your work or your ideas, your vision in some way to an audience or to other collaborators, with the risk there of critique and of having to kind of really shift, you know, having to be responsive, legitimately engage with somebody and responsive. Have you got any kind of tips or any suggestions of how you manage that, how you do that? That's hard.
I think you also avoided another word, having to be successful. You know, I think there's a very big push to the idea of success and winning and getting it right the first time. And I think, I've got to say, I think universities do a terrible job with that too. But we hopefully don't. You know, part of what we try to do is to set up a space where there is the potential for getting something wrong in order to get it right. You know, and we have to, because we have carriage of people who are learning creativity. If you can't get it wrong, then to get it right and to understand what needs to get right, then there's no, you know, learning ground with it. But I think it is important to kind of balance it, because we do have to actually be successful in our areas. And so part of it is about is about risk, but it's also about knowing it's a risk. You know, it's about recognising when to take those risks and when not to. And with clients, you know, that's also about trying to work out, and I'm using the term client in a very broad sense, it's whoever is commissioning a work, and it might be yourself. You know, you might be the person who's doing the risk analysis, because if I don't make a good musical product, nobody's going to come, you know, might be it. But there's also the lens of where am I booking as a musician, you know, and who's booking me and why are they booking me and what do they expect out of me each time. So people can have these very sophisticated notions of being able to have total courage of that, but we actually still make choices about it. You know, I'm not going to kind of do something crazy as a musician on stage before I've tested it. So it's about that testing ground. It's the same with design. You know, it's about trying things out, but then using the lens of those factors. Who's this for? What's the brief? You know, so the whole idea, and I often hear it described in terms of the design and art process, and this is true across all creative industries, but, you know, that idea that, you know, you, as an artist, you make the brief, as a designer, you meet the brief, you know, so that I'm designing to my artistic idea. So I'm designing my the musical experience that people are having, but it's, you know, but it's within this broader frame, and that's, of course, going back to that idea of that larger shape. You know, so that in that larger shape we have a, you know, an idea of what we're trying to do, and then within that we've got these processes that we need to carry out to get there. So I need to make sure I can play well enough to be able to, you know, deliver to an audience. I need to make sure that I'm sufficiently rehearsed that it actually sounds right. I need to make sure that it's something, to some extent, that the audience is expecting, but in other ways I may want to extend that, and that's the risk. You know, so that if I'm suddenly, you know, I used to do a show called Neil, 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 which was Neil Diamond, Neil Sedaka and Neil, who am I missing? Young. Neil Young. And so it was kind of this whole, you know, drag performance of me performing 3 of these characters. Now, I mean, the audience didn't like all of those 3 people because they're like completely disconnected. So there had to be a connection point, and I had to run a risk each time that I would have an audience that didn't engage with that work. This happens. Like, this is always about real things. It's always about real projects that are happening in our lives, real events or real jobs that are continuing that we're building on, you know. And so creativity isn't some, you know, the reason I use an example is that creativity has to have examples. You know, it's the only thing that makes it real, is to say this isn't just a, you know, an idea. It is actually, it has to have an application. And so it's in that application that we work out how to manage the risk.
And see, I'll just touch very quickly on this, but you sort of alluded, you didn't explicate, but you kind of alluded to cultural difference, or the fact that not everyone is necessarily going to be tuned into or enjoy everything that you do. You know, how do you maintain your sense of who you are, your values, within maybe an external brief where you have to deliver for somebody else, and obviously you've just mentioned for an audience? How does that become informed? Is that through engaging in other people's work and identifying what feels and suits right with you? Is it through reading? Is it through, you know, how do you inform your concept, your vision, who you are, if you like?
Yes, all of that.
Yes,
all of that, I think. And I think we do it as creative artists. I think we do it as people. I think we make decisions about what we're comfortable with and what we are willing to engage with. So, you know, and I think for audiences, because in the field of creativity, if it has application, it has audience. You know, and so if that's true, then part of what we have to do is to work out what we're trying to present to an audience, not just what they can hear. And so if I, you know, as an Aboriginal woman, for instance, You know, and I can say I'm an Aboriginal woman, I'm a Wiradjuri woman more specifically. You know, as a Wiradjuri woman, there's things that I feel uncomfortable about saying on behalf of a whole lot of Aboriginal people, but sometimes people will want me to do that, you know, and sometimes we're required to speak on behalf of a broader cultural group, or we're required to represent in a very particular way, sometimes as women, you know, sometimes as men, sometimes as whatever we're doing. We've got these kind of markers of that representation. And I think we have to work out how that jives with our with what we're willing to do publicly, because audiences are about a kind of public space. And so I would say that what I do publicly is quite different to what I do privately, or can be different. It's not always different, but it can be different. And I think part of what we learn in how we engage in creativity and how we engage in creative making is to understand what we're willing to do, and also to understand what we're not. What assumptions we make about audiences, and what assumptions we shouldn't make. You know, so going back to the whole museums idea, you know, looking at a museum, you know, quite often they will narrow to very, very conservative ideas of who comes into that space. But I can tell you that the research shows that that's a mistake. Again, they don't need to have 100% of people coming into their museum. They need to have museums that mean something to different groups. And there is capacity now to understand that better than there used to be, because there's a better understanding of audiences, of visitors, of people who are engaging with the material. And so it's a relationship that you're building with an audience, whether it's about your own personal cultural experiences or whether it's about what you're doing, you know. So
to a certain extent, it's always about your own cultural, personal experiences, isn't
absolutely.
it? You know, you take yourself into your work.
You do.
And whether that's a conscious thing or otherwise.
Yeah, that's right. No, I think part of what's happened in the past is that there's been this idea of the central person. And this is what the museum has done. It's gone, oh, we've got a type of person. And marketing will often use this idea of a very, you know, of profiles of people. And profiles of people work to a certain extent. They're actually quite helpful, and then they don't, you know, and then, you know, and that's where risk comes in as well, where you have to understand that you're never going to be able to determine who that person is, and sometimes even how you're going to engage with that, because you are an individual who is loaded up with a whole lot of cultural baggage, whatever that is, you know, so, but it's important for people to recognise that they have culture. You know, there's a very, you know, deep problem, particularly across areas of creative practice, where people will say, oh, I don't really have culture. That's not really part of what I do, I make. And, you know, the difficulty with that is that it's not really honouring their cultural background, but it's also not recognising the difference between them and their audience, you know, who will share something different. And so I always suggest that people think about what their cultural background is. There's no such thing as a person without a cultural background. You know, it's, but how well people understand that and how well they understand what that means. And I always use the example of, you know, culture is sometimes in the things that you do. So if you do Christmas, then you know it's one of your cultural markers, and understanding what that means. So say if it's Christmas and going, well, Christmas means a certain thing in terms of you know, how you might present food in a museum. Well, does it for everyone? And it's okay if it doesn't. But what does that mean? You know, so it's just asking more questions. I mean, it raises more questions than it always does. And that's not a mistake. I think sometimes people worry that not having answers to everything is also a risk. And it's not necessarily. Sometimes the risk is not asking that question in the first place.
That's great. So I'm just wondering, did you have anything that you wanted to say to our students before you left today in terms of how they might engage in their creative journey, if you've got any tips on how to maintain a creative kind of impulse or energy?
I think it's important to remember that creativity happens in other spaces than just art making, because I think people get told that. And, you know, the experience can be, there's a lot of artists who aren't very creative, and there's a lot of people who are working in laundromats who do a lot of creativity in the way that they think through problems. I use the laundromat example because I used to work in a laundromat. And I think I was quite creative in the way that I did it, because it's a part of what I think about creativity is around finding solutions. It's around thinking of situations and imagining. You know, it's around the idea of the imagination, and it's around that idea of compelling a possibility in the future that doesn't exist in the now. And you can apply that to anything. And I love that about creativity. It's probably the reason why I always see everything that I do as creative, even my paperwork stuff. And when it's not, it's stale and it's very much of the past. And I think that's a really telling thing. So I think what we have to do is kind of recognise that sometimes we have to do some pedestrian things to kind of get to that creativity as well, but that it makes the process of, making those creative artefacts that we often do so much better, because we're just good at it. You know, suddenly we're good at these things, and then we're able to produce something that's really nice. So, yeah.
That's perfect, thank you. Okay, thanks everybody, we'll see you next week.